Hello, everyone, and welcome to the first webinar for the Global DEI webinar series, Global Perspectives on Diversity, Equity, and Inclusion. My name is Kathy Huber, and I'm the Senior Director of Global Initiatives and Scholarly Engagement in the Global Programs and Strategy Alliance. I begin today with an acknowledgement that the land that I and many of you stand on today is located on traditional, ancestral, and contemporary lands of the Dakota people. Wherever you find yourself at this moment, whether you are in Crookston, Duluth, Morris, Rochester, the Twin Cities, elsewhere in the US or in the world, I invite each of you to take a moment to reflect and acknowledge the peoples whose land you live, work, and learn. Acknowledging the land and our history in this space is an offering of solidarity with and respect for Native nations and peoples who were here before us, are here now, and who will continue to be here in the future. Today's webinar is part of the Global Diversity, Equity, and Inclusion Initiative, launched by the GPS Alliance in partnership with many others across the University of Minnesota system. For many of you, this is the first time you're hearing about this initiative, so let me provide you with a bit more context. Just a moment. Historically, international education was perceived to operate separately from diversity and equity work. International education, as many of you know, focuses on sending US students abroad, bringing international students and scholars to the US, and generally building bridges across countries and cultures. DEI practitioners, on the other hand, are often perceived to focus more on social justice and inclusion efforts within the borders of the US. In recent years, however, especially during the onset of the global COVID-19 pandemic and the racial reckoning during the summer of 2020, there's been an increased emphasis on the intersection between the goals of increasing intercultural understanding through global education and the goals to create a culture of belonging in our communities, especially to historically underrepresented, often marginalized people in the US. How can we, as University of Minnesota staff and faculty, ensure that our international students and scholars are more than just their visa status and are seen to have multiple intersecting identities, just as any US student or faculty? And how can we ensure that our students who go abroad are prepared to encounter differences, not only in language and culture, but also in how the host country might define diversity, equity, and inclusion? The Global DEI Initiative seeks to do the following: engage and educate the University of Minnesota community about the intersection of DEI and international education. This is about raising awareness and deepening understanding of this intersection. The initiative seeks to generate dialogue about diversity and inclusion through a global and intercultural lens, and understand how this lens enhances and contributes to DEI work overall. We seek to explore notions of diversity across and within cultures. So what does diversity mean from a Japanese context, or from an Australian or a Kenyan context? And what does this difference in definitions mean for our students who are traveling to these countries, or international students or scholars who are coming to the University of Minnesota? And finally, we seek to facilitate conversations about identity and intersectionality within a global context. I'm very pleased that we have a group of diverse panelists today who will touch on several of these goals by sharing their own unique perspectives and experiences. Our panelists are Sayan Bay. Sayan graduated from the University of Minnesota Twin Cities in December 2021 with Bachelor of Science degrees in Psychology and Strategic Communication. They now work at Cummins as a marketing specialist and serve as a member of the Diversity, Equity, and Inclusion Committee for the East Asian Employee Resource Group and Pride Employee Resource Group. Sayan also works with the National Alliance on Mental Illness, or NAMI, Minnesota as a peer support group facilitator and board member for the Multicultural Young Adults Advisory Board to increase mental health awareness in marginalized communities. Maria Rosa Metifogo serves as academic coordinator for the University of Minnesota's Study and Intern program at the Accent Global Learning Center in Florence, Italy. Maria Rosa also leads workshops on intercultural learning, teaches a course on Florence and literature, and coordinates the University of California Education Abroad programs in Florence. Maria Rosa holds a PhD in comparative literature from the University of California, Davis, and has been working in the field of international education for over 15 years. Sade Oshifuye is the academic counselor and accommodation specialist at DIS, Study Abroad in Scandinavia, and is based in Copenhagen, Denmark. They previously held positions as assistant director of the Student Disability Center and as an education abroad coordinator, both at Colorado State University. They received their Master of Arts in Multicultural Teaching and Learning from the University of Minnesota. Welcome to our panelists. We will start today by having each of our panelists talk about how diversity, equity, and inclusion are defined and talked about in the country or countries that they are most familiar with. We will then invite each of them to share how DEI shows up for them, personally and professionally. If you have a question for our panelists, please feel free to type it in using the Q&A function. We have allotted 15 minutes at the end of this webinar to answer all of your questions. So we will be collecting those and we can address them to the panelists at the end. Please note in your question if it is for one of the panelists or for all three to respond to. And with that, we'll get started. Sayan, let's start with you.
Hi, everybody. I'm honored to be here today. I wanted to kind of talk about how diversity is defined in my hometown or my home country in South Korea. I was born and raised in Seoul, South Korea, and came to the US to study my bachelor's of science at the U to Minnesota. I did live in California, San Diego for a little bit when I was younger, so I have a little bit of context there. But when it comes to talking about diversity in South Korea, I want to have a disclaimer that I don't want to speak for everyone. And I've also heard that a lot has changed since I left for college, living in Seoul like regularly, but there is still not a lot of conversation around diversity, equity, and inclusion in South Korea as far as I've heard and seen myself. And traditionally, Korean culture has prided itself in having a very homogenous population and culture. And I think for that, they take it as diversity is something that kind of hurts our tradition or our pride as Koreans, which has not been true. Like since history, there has been a lot of diverse ethnicity and nationality within South Korea. I think it's something that has been just not been educated throughout our history. And I think it definitely made it a little bit more difficult for folks to even discuss or even think about the idea of diversity within South Korea. But I do want to say that I've seen much more conversation around ability, race, ethnicity, sexuality, gender come up recently, which I see as something that is hopeful when I'm thinking about the future of DEI within South Korea. But there is still a lot of conversation around queerness that is considered hot topic or something that is a little bit more controversial. So as you can tell from my Zoom name, I identify as non-binary and I exclusively use they, them pronouns. And I also identify as queer as of my sexuality. So personally, I do have a lot of experiences with talking about my queerness and my non-binary gender with a lot of folks in Korea. And I think it has a lot of difficult emotions regarding how to approach it, or if they even have heard of the term non-binary when I do have those conversations with folks. And I do definitely think that there are generational gaps of comfortability when discussing DEI and the topics related to it, like queerness, for example. The younger generation definitely seems more comfortable compared to the older generation. And I've also seen a lot of people talk about queerness more openly, or talk about race and ability and sexism. And I also have seen more people from quote unquote non-traditional Korean ethnicities or background on media, which I think has really positive influence on how people see DEI in South Korea, and also have positive representations of them on media. And more people are being exposed to it, which means I hope that it would lead to more conversations and more deeper understanding about what DEI means. But I also do think that there is not a lot of conversation around equity and inclusion specifically. I think we just started having conversations about diversity, but not a lot of emphasis on what it actually means to let them have say, or let them have equal opportunity or equal rights as the majority, or the people who have been historically in power in South Korea. There is still a lot of colorism, fat phobia, queer phobia, racism, sexism, ableism, and so many more that is deeply enrooted in Korean culture. And I think it's really important for Korean folks to understand our limitations as lighter skinned people of color in global context, because I think there's a dangerous context when it comes to at least my community, which is Korean folks, who think we can't be racist because we're also people of color, or we also go through so much discrimination in the world that like we don't have to care about other people who also go through discrimination. And I've seen those like color blindness, or using our identity as folks of BIPOC communities as a shield of lack of effort in fully understanding the concepts of DEI. And to me, that is some of the most important aspects that I think as a community that we need to work on when it comes to actually moving forward from not just diversity, but also identifying equity and inclusive ways to make our communities better, not just in like South Korean context, but with the whole global context as well.
Thank you, Soyeon, very much. Maria Rosa.
Hello, hi everybody. It's a pleasure to be here. Thank you, Kathy, for inviting me to say a few things about how diversity is defined in Italy. As a premise to this, I think it is worth noting, first of all, that in Italy, the acronym DEI is new and only very sparsely used. For the most part, we hear about it when we do in business and in professional coaching and training. And even in these fields, the preferred phrase is diversity and inclusion, for example, diversity and inclusion management. And this is for an obvious reason. Diversity, equity, and inclusion naturally resonate differently to Italian ears, as they have to do with a different history of gender, religious, racial, and social identities in my country. So the focus on language and discrimination and on changing language practices is, in my opinion, well, it's not just my opinion, a distinct trait of the discourse on diversity in Italy. It's a discourse that stresses how certainly commonly used words, phrases, or language practices contribute to perpetuating and somehow to institutionalizing, because they are accepted in the current language, they're not very contested, various forms of discrimination, mostly when we talk about race and gender. So one thing that I think is also important to understand as we delve into, let's say, this aspect of the language practices that in Italy lead sometimes to forms of institutionalized discrimination. I think it's important to keep in mind that, for example, the concept of politically incorrect language or behavior does not really exist in Italy. And actually, when it's named, it is oftentimes met with hostility. It's named in derogatory terms as a kind of American import that doesn't really belong culturally here. As an example of how language is still very much, let's say, the terrain of contention when it comes to the discourse on diversity in Italy, I wanted to make a reference to two terms that, of course, are crucial here. One is race, and the other one is equality. Equality when it is applied to gender or sexual equality, because both terms, again, they are example of what I'm trying to illustrate. They've long been debated by activists, politicians, and the media. Example, the word race. It was the razza. It was the object of a heated political debate when it came to include it in the third article of the Italian Constitution. So we are after World War II, 1947, the Italian Constitution, Article 3, condemns every form of discrimination based on various factors, including race. So the word race is chosen for this article, but again, it was at the center of a debate because scientifically speaking, in the Italian language, it's a term that applies to animals and not to humans. When it comes to humans, there is another term, it's stirpe. Stirpe translates more as lineage, that is generally used. However, the Constituent Assembly still decided to use the term razza, so race, in the Constitution to signal, to mark an explicit distance from Mussolini's racial laws of 1938, because it was fascism that introduced the word razza in its political discourse. And so again, the term itself has been at the center, and had actually this debate has been revamped in recent years. Another term that, let's say, has a different aura in Italy that it can have, for example, in the US context, is the term equality, which has been long contested and ultimately rejected in the context of the feminist movement in Italy. And I'm talking mostly about the main school of Italian feminism, the second wave Italian feminism. So equality, for example, sexual equality, is a term that raises eyebrows among Italian feminists. And why? Because again, the main, let's say, school of Italian feminism, differently from the emancipationist approach of American feminism, has always been grounded, like the French feminist tradition, in the notion and valorization of sexual difference. And so this leads to rejecting the notion of equality. And this, again, marks, let's say, the destiny of this word, because the legacy of that movement is still quite present in the Italian context and in the language employed around gender identities. So difference rather than diversity is vindicated with pride within this tradition. And that's why there's a kind of a rejection of the term equality. This said, the way that diversity is defined and approached in Italy today is obviously impacted by a variety of other historically specific or culturally specific factors. Think, for example, of the migration flows towards Italian shores from Asian, Eastern European, Middle Eastern, African countries in the past decades. These migration flows, in many cases, are tragic stories, are oftentimes in the media, and they have ramifications into the political, of course, arena. Or think of the influence of the Vatican on jurisdiction regarding LGBTQI legislation or rights. Let's say the hot topics today are in Italy around diversity are somehow connected to what I just introduced above. Just to name a few, the right of citizenship, for example, for many of the refugees that arrived to Italian shores. The presence of and the need to integrate different religions into the community, a community that has traditionally been Catholic. And then last but not least, the current political landscape. You may have heard that we now have a far-right nationalist coalition ruling the country, as of this past October. And so the parties of this coalition have built their political agenda and campaign on demonizing, for example, refugees disembarking in Italy. They've also blocked anti-transphobic and anti-homophobic legislation that was proposed by the previous government. So it will be, so many people are kind of waiting to see what will happen, how this will play out in terms of the diversity discourse in Italy. It would be interesting to see whether this political climate will silence the anti-discriminatory movements or, on the contrary, will make them more vocal.
Thank you very much, Maria Rosa. Sade.
Hello, everyone. My name is Sade Oshifuye. And so, okay, I was sort of pondering, my response as I was listening. And I'm just going to start off very real and very transparent with all of you. I accepted a position with DIS. It's been almost a year. And when the invitation was extended, I honestly was like, I don't even know where Denmark is, like, just being completely honest. Like, I knew it was in Scandinavia, but I didn't know exactly what direction it was in. And so it's interesting because I consider myself just I love to learn about different people and different cultures. I studied abroad in Kenya. I lived in Kenya. I studied in South Africa. I love traveling the world. And so when the opportunity came up to pursue this dream job, in my opinion, I went for it, not really knowing much about the culture, not knowing much about Danes and Danish cultural norms. And so when I arrived in Denmark in January, there was so much to gain in terms of knowledge and experience. And so I like to say I started with our spring 2022 cohort students, because they landed and began their semester a week after I arrived. And so, as a means to sort of navigate in different spaces and in different conversations and interactions with people, I also was like, I'm learning myself professionally, personally, what it means for me to be in a country that I'm learning and navigating through, and having intentional conversations with different people to understand where I'm at, the conversations I'm having, and also the historical context. And so I decided that, I was going to have this initiative, my own personal initiative, to just ask some Danes, Danish colleagues and Danish friends more about just diversity, equity, and inclusion from their perspective. So this is not representing the whole entire country. These are just simply their opinions, their perspectives, and their knowledge based on them being born in Denmark, living and growing up in their country. And so I had the opportunity, just for my own personal knowledge, but also in preparation for this webinar, to just sort of hear some perspectives, to get a better sense of what their view is on DEI. And with Maria Rosa, like such terminology is not very familiar in Denmark from the knowledge I've gained, but there's still very much conversation related to these topics that are happening in Denmark. So one of my friends, she had agreed to educate me from her perspective. And she had said, I have some notes pulled up, so I'll just read from those. She said, we really can't assume that there is a universal understanding of diversity in Denmark. She also continued to say that it's very different. There's different perspectives about how diversity is perceived. She said a lot of people from her social circle and in her surroundings they don't have much awareness of their colonial history. And she said that she's very aware of her colonial background, which doesn't go back too far, but she has never been proud of it because of her awareness of the colonial background and history of the enslavement of people. She has never been proud of that history and has hated it. So that was her perspective and some of the knowledge that she shared with me, knowing a little bit about how diversity is perceived. I asked a colleague, a colleague within my organization about their perspective regarding diversity, equity, and inclusion. And they shared with me that from their perspective, Danes are very familiar with diversity and how it's defined, but more in relation to gender diversity. So male and female, and also like male, females in the workplace. They did say that there is not a collective understanding of the how of diversity, especially as it relates to people of color and pronouns. One other thing that she did mention, which I thought was eye-opening for me, is she said the term diversity itself has been very monopolized by the feminist movement. And they have had a very strong voice and a strong presence in Denmark. And she said there's this museum in Aarhus, which is the second largest city in Denmark. And this museum was called the Women's Museum. But as an effort to be more inclusive and more progressive, they actually changed this museum name from the Women's Museum to the Gender Museum. So as of right now, this museum exists as the Gender Museum to be inclusive of all people. And in terms of equity, they also shared from their perspective that it's not easily understood. There's not a collective understanding about what it means to be inclusive, what it means to have like an equitable resources, like what is that term? What is it really called? What does it really mean? But there is more of an awareness, and I think a even expanded definition and understanding of what inclusion means. And inclusion is often being seen in even in school settings. Little children are talking about it. And she even mentioned having assemblies and conversations around, what does it mean to be inclusive? What does it mean to have this and not have this, or for different people to look this way and for them to all still be accepted? So it's really great to hear that some of these topics are being taught to children in schools, but she said that there's still a long way to go because of just not really knowing what the terminology is, but then also perceiving it through your own definition, how you were brought up, how you were raised to think about these certain topics or lack of.
Thank you, Sade, and excuse me, and Sayan and Maria Rosa. I really appreciate you sharing those perspectives. I think that they, each of you shared about it in a slightly different way, and I think that it demonstrated how complex this issue is and what it means when we're thinking about DEI within a global context. So I'd like to shift, and I'd now like to ask a question to each of our panelists that will help us dive more deeply to see how each panelist has experienced DEI within their own personal and professional context. And Sayan, my first question is for you. And my question is, so you have recently transitioned from life as a University of Minnesota student to a full-time working professional. Could you share more about when you felt the importance of DEI on your intersectional identities, so race, nationality, gender, and sexuality, in a professional environment?
Yeah, thank you, Kathy. I think there were three pivotal moments that I would say kind of shaped my idea or how I felt DEI is such an important part of like my everyday life, especially as a working professional. So the first instance that I had it was I was very fortunate enough to be in an environment where I was heavily involved with DEI related trainings and everyday focuses, which was my first job in college was being a community advisor at the U through housing and residential life. And through that, I think I was introduced to so many different concepts. So coming from South Korea, DEI was rarely talked about. I would say almost never. So I was just so overwhelmed by all the different ideas that I never even had to think about up until I became a CA and I was forced to think about DEI through my job. And through that job, I've met so many amazing people, not just through education, but just all of my friends that I met through that job are still my best friends. And they have helped me so much in navigating my own identities as a queer person. I came out as bisexual first, my first year as a CA in like 2 months because it was just so normalized for me to be in that community of people who normalized it for me, which then made me be comfortable to even come out to myself. And I think that experience just really helped me develop a good foundation for my standards of DEI in my everyday life, not just my friends or who I surround myself with, but also professionally. Like these are the people that I hope I can work with who share these similar values and ideas of what a full person should bring into the table when they are working. And my second instance was for my last 3 semesters, including the summer, I worked as a peer advisor at CLA Career Services at the U as well. And this really gave me a deeper understanding of how I want to show up in a more like adult, quote unquote, professional world. And at that time, I also came out as non-binary my last semester fully. And I was really nervous to navigate the professional world with my gender identity because the only professional experience that I've heard about was mostly from like a Korean context. And gender identity is just never talked about. And so I couldn't even ask for advice on how did you navigate being non-binary at an office, or what do you do when somebody misgenders you? So I think I was just really scared and nervous as a young professional just starting out. And I was also thinking about if I come out my first day, is that going to be okay? Or do I wait until a couple months to come out? Or what kind of environments or what kind of companies would let me be myself and wouldn't have any retaliation when I come out? Or if there is any discrimination within the work environment, would the company or people around me be able to support me through figuring that out, or have any repercussions when people are being discriminatory towards me just for my queerness or my race or my nationality? And my last example is one of my favorite memories ever. And the company that I currently work with now, I was an intern the summer before I graduated in December. And I was lucky enough to be in the same team. So I was going back to the same manager that I had. And I was really nervous about going back because throughout my last semester, I came out as non-binary fully. So my manager knew me as she, her, and now they had to transition into calling me a they, them. So even like during the first day, I was super nervous. I wasn't sure if I wanted to come out at work or if I just should like go by she, her and call it a day. And I remember the first day I went back, my manager sent out a welcome email to the whole team introducing me as a new full-time marketing specialist joining the team. And he, without asking me, just used they, them pronouns for me. And I vividly remember crying reading the email, and I took a video of myself crying and sent it to my friends who knew it was my first day. And I think that experience really changed how I view myself in the professional world. And I told my manager this too, and I really love him, how that instance really made me feel comfortable to come out at the workplace. And immediately I put they, them pronouns on my email, my Zoom, everything. And I have been out since day one at my work. And it was such a pivotal moment that I think hopefully all queer folks can experience moving forward, that it really means a lot when that one person just like makes you feel really comfortable. And my company at least has been very, very great with advocacy for LGBTQ plus folks and employees in the past. And that's also one of the reasons why I decided to go back. But yeah, I think those three were the most important experiences that I had that kind of shaped how I, as a professional, interact with others, or how I hold myself in professional settings personally.
Soyan, thank you. That was beautiful. And I want to acknowledge that it was, it means a lot that you shared that personal story with all of us. And I appreciate that very, very much. Maria Rosa, working with primarily US students in Italy, and given what you just shared about how that conversation is being held around diversity and to a lesser extent equity and inclusion, can you share how DEI is talked about in the academic programs that you coordinate in Florence? And what's most important for you in providing support to US students that are studying in Italy?
Yeah, Kathy, because of what I said before, what I feel is the most important when it comes to supporting US students as they navigate diversity, equity, and inclusion in Italy is really to provide them with as much context as possible to understand what they will inevitably perceive as macroscopic differences on this terrain between Italy and the US. For example, just explaining the language that is employed in Italy, that is used in Italy to discuss social identities, can offer an initial and a basic lens through which the students can read some situations that either they experience personally or they observe or are reported to them by others. It is important that they understand how even the concept of a politically correct language, like I said before, does not really exist in Italy. And how, for example, it is totally acceptable here to profile people based on their appearance or ethnicity, or to ask about their background or even about their political ideas. Italians are very direct in this respect, and they will not refrain, for example, from staring at you if they find your look or your appearance interesting. Could be also in an aesthetically pleasing way, but they don't have a problem with staring at people, and sometimes students find that a little threatening or perplexing. And so in working with students on these US versus Italy differences, let's say our job, my job and my colleagues' job is not so much about reaching an agreement on what is right or wrong. We do it better, it's better here, it's less racist, it's more racist, which system is better, which is worse. I think it's instead about providing tools to the students for reading situations in context. And in a way, I have to say, it is quite a delicate balance. It's an exercise in balancing, let's say, cultural relativism with the awareness that not all incidents or forms of bias that the students will encounter in Italy, because yes, Italy is a racist society, like most societies, racist and discriminatory. So not all of the incidents and bias they will encounter here can be dismissed as culturally relative situations. So again, it's about striking a very delicate balance there. And it's also about bearing in mind that the study abroad experience is very powerful in this respect. It's unique to every student precisely because of their intersectional identities. And as professionals or as alumni in this field, we know very well that studying abroad has a lot to do with self-knowledge, identity quest, self-discovery, personal and collective identity. And for many students, studying abroad becomes really a journey of identity discovery. And it's not always a pleasant or a harmless or a smooth journey. So to me and my colleagues, it's essential to provide students with, I would say, mainly two types of support. The first one would be, for example, to explain, like I said, the history of and language of diversity and discrimination in Italy, where it comes from, how it's treated in culture in current debates, what changes are being proposed or discussed or made in Italy. And I'm thinking, for example, of language teaching, like teaching Italian language. Very early, even in the beginner classes, the language instructors must tackle with students the issue of a lack of gender neutrality in the Italian language. So this is it's actually one of the hot topics that are being debated now, like how do you make the Italian language more gender neutral? So for them, this is an opportunity to explain the practices that are being introduced and experimented today. And I'm saying experimented because really there hasn't been a general agreement as of today on more inclusive language practices. And so different solutions, strategies are tested out. And talking about gender neutrality, we have a very timely example. We now have our very first female prime minister, Giorgia Meloni. First time in the history of the Italian Republic that we have a female prime minister. So that is quite an accomplishment. And she chose to be called Il Presidente del Consiglio, meaning Mr. President, Mr. Prime Minister, instead of Miss Prime Minister. So this is really like, the way it sounds in Italian, Il Presidente really sounds like a male title. So this has been the object of a lot of debates recently. The other thing that is important to do is to create safe spaces at the study center and within the program for the students where incidents or the questions that they have on situations they've observed or can be discussed and unpacked together, because we are not experts, but it's about providing a safe space of discussion. For example, sometimes we get students asking us if Italian were racist or homophobic. Of course they are. We live in a racist world. But the fact that it comes more as a surprise, I think sometimes for Italians, it's because Italians ask themselves this question a lot. Are we racist? And this has to do in a way with a myth of the Italian people as brava gente, gli italiani brava gente, the Italian people as good people. This is a post-World War II myth that in a way obfuscates our past and has prevented the country from coming to terms collectively, for example, with its own history of colonialism, what Shade was saying before about Denmark, and fascism. And this also explains the persistence of commonly accepted discriminatory language and the importance that is assigned today to changing some of these practices. And so keeping the students in the loop on these discussions is really of paramount importance to us.
Thank you very much, Maria Rosa. Shade, you mentioned that you have just been in Denmark for almost not yet a year, and you have this interesting background of studying abroad in different places. And I'd like for you, if you would please, share how the intersections of your identities show up for you now that you're living in Denmark and in your roles as an academic support and accommodation specialist at DIS.
Absolutely. I'm going to be cognizant of time here, so I'll try to shorten my response just a little bit. But I want to sort of talk about the intersections of my identity. Identity is just being a person that is half Nigerian, queer and disabled, and has had a very tumultuous religious journey from childhood to now blooming into this wonderful spiritual journey path that I have redefined and created for myself. And so it's my trajectory, as Kathy has said, it's been beautiful. It's been not so beautiful at times, but it's been such a wonderful learning journey for the lessons and the reminders that I have along the way. And so my exploration sort of in evolution from the times of in phases and cycles of me evolving into the person that I am today have really shaped me based on the places I've lived, what I've experienced, what I've had to go through. And I can certainly just say, you know, being raised in a Black church and going to a predominantly almost all white school and having that education in the suburbs was quite the experience. And then also being queer and being in the church and not feeling like I was accepted and not feeling like I could bring my full self because of who I was, and aspects of who I was weren't deemed as accepted in the church. And so when that sort of this opportunity to be on a different country, a different continent, in a place that I didn't know anyone, I thrive off of those environments where I can go into a space and no one knows me and I can fully evolve into being my authentic self. And that's what happened for me in Denmark. I know that, you know, in the US, in the working environment, I never felt like I could bring my true authentic self. I felt like there are pieces of me that I was more aware of in predominantly white spaces. I was more aware of the color of my skin, and knowing that I had to sort of present myself a certain way or talk a certain way depending on the space that I was in, all in the US. And now living in Denmark, I bring my authentic self to every space there is. You don't have to be curious or wonder which Sade is going to show up in a sense. It's like, I'm bringing myself that day. I'm bringing my whole self. And I now have the awareness and the acceptance and the evolution of who I am to be completely comfortable with walking into a space. I no longer feel like I'm the only person of color in these spaces. I'm not even looking at that. And it's interesting because in Denmark, you know, this sort of conception of whiteness and Blackness that exists in the States and so is so pervasive in the States is not here. It's you're German, you're Norwegian, you're Danish. And so I'm sort of defined in Denmark as an American. I'm not asked about where, you know, what's my ethnicity, or, you know, I've even had questions in the States. What are you mixed with? You know, those type of things that are very inappropriate to ask a person. But here I'm not asked that. And so it's been relieving for me. It's been allowing me to show up and just flow through my life and my cycles of experience and knowledge and wisdom, and actually embracing and being proud of existing in whatever space that I occupy. And so when I work with students, and I work with students, I have a student-facing position, and there are students of color, there are students with different intersections of their identities that are in Denmark and sort of experience, well, you know, I was walking in Denmark, in Copenhagen, and I saw this person of color, and they didn't even say anything to me. Like, they acted like I didn't exist. I wasn't noticed. If I was in the US, that wouldn't happen. There'd be like a head nod, some sort of recognition that I see you, you see me. And so I've had to have conversations with students and say, this is what you're existing in right now. And it's a different environment. It's a different cultural environment. And this is what it looks like. This is how it is in the US, and this is how it is here. And so you're going to learn how to embrace and sort of adapt to the differences. It doesn't mean it's negative. It doesn't mean it's wrong. It's the way that people are existing and being in a different cultural context that's unfamiliar to yours. And so those are sort of those conversations that I have, which I'm living through as well. I mean, coming to Denmark and not seeing anyone sort of smile tossed me. I was like, oh, no one's smiling. And then one of my Danish friends said, oh, well, which time of the year did you come? And I said, January. And they're like, yeah, it's cold and it's dark early. I mean, people are just running from work to go to their homes. And so that was something that I didn't know. I took it personally. Like, wow, why aren't people greeting me? When the weather and environment and changes in situations all impact human beings. And so I just have had a lot of profound experiences that have influenced me personally, have influenced me professionally. And I'm that person when you learn something that you didn't know, it's your responsibility to now pass it on to the next, pass it on to the next generation, so that they can begin to change and shift their perspectives about how they're coming into that new experience, how they're coming into that unfamiliar experience. And I practice what I preach. I also try to do that for myself every single day. And now when I walk into a space, I'm not concerned about, oh, I'm the only person of color in the room. I could care less. Whatever color we look like doesn't matter. I really don't care. I care about connection. I care about making my presence in the space. I care about kindness and laughter, because these are the love languages that we all need as humanity. If we took away gender and we took away the ethnicity, the color of one's skin, it really is just about the connections that we make with other human beings, about soul connections. And that is what I'm invested in.
All right, thank you very much to everyone. We have just a few minutes to entertain a couple of questions. If our panelists could turn their cameras back on, and we will be able to see everyone. Your beautiful faces. Thank you. Thank you very much for this. This was fantastic. I know that I can speak personally that I enjoyed each aspect of what you all shared, whether that was from a broader context of the countries that you're in, or at a more personal level. So we have a couple of questions. One is a clarification for Maria Rosa. And the question is, what I understood you to say about feminism was that American feminism is embedded in an ocean of equality. We are just as determined by equal outcomes. And European feminism is more a celebration of the differences and making sure those differences have equal status. And the attendee would like to know if they understood this correctly, and if so, is European feminism more interested in equity versus equality?
Yes, it is understood correctly. Maybe it is worth distinguishing when we talk about European feminism. The tradition I was referring to applies mostly to Italian and French feminism. So, femminismo della differenza. In Italy, it derives from a philosophical school called Diotima. And again, yes, what the person who asked the question wrote is correct. It's not the feminist struggle. The feminist fights have not been about reaching equality and participating in the system. That's the language that has always been used, because it is more about allowing women or individuals who do not identify with the patriarchal symbolic order to let's say act efficiently within a different symbolic order, and that would be the feminine or matriarchal symbolic order. A lot has been said about the maternal symbolic order, for example, as part of this tradition. So yes, maybe equity is a term that describes better let's say, the outcome of these feminist vindications, but even better would be the term parity. I don't know how much it is used in the US context, parità di genere, more than equità, parity. I think it exists as a term in the English language. I don't know if it would apply nicely in this context, but in Italian we have both equality, equity, and parity is the preferred one, because I'm not even sure that the final outcomes, the preferred outcomes, would be equal outcomes. It is a philosophical approach that kind of reverses what we think, how we conceive, let's say, civil rights struggles. So it's not about being allowed participation, because it's about claiming a different system, and so reversing a patriarchal order. So that's how the language of feminism has been articulated in Italy traditionally. And again, a legacy of that is present even nowadays. I hope this somehow answers. It's a fascinating topic. At least I find it fascinating, the differences between this type of feminism and Anglo-American feminism.
Thank you for that. And unfortunately, we only have one more minute left, and I think we could talk about this all day. But I want to thank each of you, Maria Rosa, Sayan, and Sade, for sharing your experiences with us. It's deeply appreciated, and we're already getting a few comments in from some of our attendees, also thanking you for your words. So for the attendees, if you will be, when we end the webinar, there will be a survey that will pop up, and we would deeply appreciate your feedback on the survey, not only about this session, but also if you have ideas for future sessions that are related to global diversity and equity and inclusion, we would appreciate that as well. And you will also receive an email with a link to our website, which is mglobal.umn.edu/global-DEI. And that will, you can watch that space for future events and future webinars such as this. Thank you very much, everyone. And I hope you all have a wonderful day. And thank you again to the panelists.
Thank you.